Hello, everyone, and welcome to ACTC, the Association for Core Texts and Courses, first in a new series called Core Conversations. I'm Charlie Thomas. I'm a professor of philosophy at Mercer University. I direct the Great Books program and co-direct the McDonald Center for America's Founding Principles. But more importantly, today I'm a member of the board of ACTC, the Association of Core Texts and Courses. The mission of ACTC is to foster the use of core texts in undergraduate education and the development of core programs steeped in such texts. It's an organization that is dear to me, and I'm very honored to be on the board of directors. Like every other organization, maybe in the United States or maybe the world now, ACTC was trying to figure out what to do in this pandemic when we can't meet face to face as we would very much like to. And so we developed this idea that we might be able to have some conversations using Zoom technology. So this, if you're watching it, you already know it, is a recording. I'll introduce our first Core Conversation scholar in just a second. We will follow up this recording with a live Q&A. And we're going to do this about once a month for the academic year and see how it goes. We've got a lot of interesting things lined up. We'll have, I think, in every case, in every core conversation, we'll have a scholar who comes and talks about a core text. And then we'll open up conversation, replicating as much as possible the format that we use at ACTC conferences, where we write short papers and present them to each other on core texts and emphasize conversation. We're going to try to emphasize conversation here as well. But for now, we're going to let our first core conversation scholar, Roosevelt Montás, do the talking. He is a senior lecturer in American Studies and English at Columbia University. For 10 years, he was the director of the core curriculum at Columbia, the famous, and rightly so, program at Columbia focused on core texts. And I am so pleased that Roosevelt is here today. He's going to take as his text, his departure point, Frederick Douglass's "What to the Slave" is the 4th of July speech. And I'm very much looking forward to what he has to say about it. So welcome, Roosevelt. Thank you so much for being our first core conversation scholar.
Thank you so much, Charlie. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be special honor to be the inaugural speaker of this series. Thank you so much for conceiving of this and organizing it and making it easy for me. As you said, what I want to talk about today for 20 minutes or so is Frederick Douglass's "What to the Slave" is the 4th of July. And my idea here is to give a kind of top level set of pointers and frameworks that people can use to teach this text, to talk about this text with students. And then I look forward to questions. Hopefully we'll have a chance for a little bit of interaction, but then looking forward to a conversation with the broader ACTC community. So "What to the Slave" is the 4th of July is a speech delivered by Frederick Douglass in 1852. It was given not on July 4th, 1852, but on July 5th of 1852, in keeping with the traditional Black abolitionist practice of not celebrating the 4th as such, but of marking the day after as a day of abolitionist activism and of agitation. And this speech is important. It offers a sweeping analysis of the contradictions at the heart of the American national project. I tend to think of Douglass and of this speech in particular as part of a set of documents and figures involved in what I think of as the second founding of the United States, a kind of second set of founding fathers, and in this case, founding mothers. Lincoln, in his inaugural address, another of these figures and texts, rather in the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln talks about a new birth of freedom, and indeed, the Civil War is a kind of death of the Union, by secession or an attempt at secession, the death of the breakdown of the original pact, and a rebirth on a new foundation, a foundation that completes the work or advances significantly the work that was laid out in 1776 with the revolution, and in particular with the Declaration of Independence. The animated question for Douglas is, what does it mean to be an African American? And the way that Douglas approaches that question sheds light on an even more fundamental question: what does it mean to be an American? What the speech gives us is a vision of American citizenship and a vision of the role or lack of role of race in the determination of American citizenship. I want to begin by reading a passage from Douglas's narrative of the life of an American slave. It's a narrative of his life, a story of his life that he published in 1845. It's his first published work, and he did it after a few years of being out on the lecture circuit telling his story. Douglas lived a long life, and he would write two further autobiographies, My Bondage and My Freedom of 1855, and very late in life, 1881, I believe, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. This passage is to introduce who Frederick Douglass is, or at least one, I think, paradigmatic incident in his childhood that gives you, I think, of a very vivid and important sense of who this person is. Many of your students, and maybe even some of the people who tune in to watch this this broadcast, will not have read the narrative, or will only have a vague sense of Frederick Douglass as an individual. One other thing about this passage I'm about to read, in it appears prominently the N-word, spoken by Frederick Douglass's slave master. I'm not going to read out the word. I'm going to replace the word with slave, and that it's actually a kind of a teaching moment here. Douglass uses the word, and I think Douglass intends for the word to be read. That word is not a slur only recently. That is, when Douglass uses the word in 1845, it's already a slur, and he knows exactly what he's doing. Nevertheless, that word has become so charged in our environment today that it has the potential of offending and turning off people, because race, sadly, even though it's not a biological reality, is very much a social reality. And this word has been used to badger and hurt and deny the humanity of people. So in deference to that, I'm not going to use it. If I were teaching in a small classroom and I had a level of intimacy and trust with my students, I would read it. If I reach that level where I have assurance that people will not take it the wrong way, and that we have the kind of trusting relationship that permits me to go there. Since this is sort of a semi-public context, I'm not going to pronounce the word, but instead replace it with the word slave. So Douglass was born in a plantation in Maryland, and he, as a boy, around about the age of 8, was sent off to live with the family of his owner's brother. So he's sent to live in Baltimore with Hugh Auld and his wife, and their little child who's around Frederick's age. And the idea was to bring Frederick to be a kind of companion to the little boy, and a domestic slave to Thomas and Sophia Auld. So here goes Douglass. Very soon after I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld, she very kindly commenced to teach me the ABC, that is, to teach him to read and write, literacy. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at this point of my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on, and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. To use his own words further, he said, "If you give a slave an inch, he will take an L." We have a contemporary version of this expression: you give someone an inch and they'll take a mile. So that's what this means. An L is like the corner of a house. A slave should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning would spoil the best slave in the world. Now, said he, if you teach that slave, speaking of myself, how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation, explaining dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but had struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. It was just what I wanted, and I got it at the time when I least expected it. Whilst I was saddened by the thought of losing the aid of my kind mistress, I was gladdened by the invaluable instruction which by the merest accident I had gained from my master. Though conscious of the difficulty of learning without a teacher, I set out with high hope and a fixed purpose, at whatever cost of trouble, to learn how to read. Just an extraordinary passage. Every time I read it, I get goosebumps. It captures something so powerful and fundamental about the idea of education, and in particular about the idea of liberal education. Right? Liberal education liberates you. Liberal education unfits you to be a slave. And that's what Douglas realizes. From that moment, he says, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. And before that, he says that he understood the key to the white man's capacity to enslave the black man. The key was learning. The key was literacy. Douglas goes ahead and has, fascinating story of how he teaches himself to read and write. He uses the writing copybooks and lessons for little Thomas, and he manages to erase his handwriting so that he can then use it to practice his own. He gives pieces of bread and bribes other children in the neighborhood to pass on the lessons they're getting at school. At some point, Douglas walks into a bookshop in Baltimore and buys the Columbian Orator, a collection of speeches essentially about freedom. That somehow he got wind that this was a widely used textbook in the schools to teach rhetoric, to teach oratory. So he purchases that and gets there the beginnings of his training in anti-slavery speech oratory and in speaking on behalf of freedom. It's this man who at age 20 escaped slavery and not long after has occasion to tell his story before none other than William Lloyd Garrison, the founder of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, and also the person who really sparked the anti-slavery movement that eventually culminated in the Civil War. There was always a small and never politically significant anti-slavery movement, anti-slavery organization in the United States. The Quakers played a big role, but not until 1831, when William Lloyd Garrison burst into the scene, does the movement pick up the kind of steam and the kind of widespread adoption that would eventually culminate in enforcing the issue before the national consciousness. Douglas becomes a speaker for Garrison's organization. Eventually publishes the narrative in 1845, essentially writing down the story he's been telling as a itinerant lecturer. He then spent some time in England, because once the narrative comes out, he is identifiable and could be captured and returned to slavery under the provisions of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So he flees to England and spends almost 2 years there. He returns to the United States, having bought his freedom from England. Bunch of friends raise some money. He opens a correspondence with his owner, Hugh Old, and eventually is able to purchase his freedom and returns to America, free man, and moves to Rochester, where he opens a printing press and starts his own newspaper, the North Star. And it is after being in Rochester a few years that he is invited by the Ladies Anti-Slavery Association of Rochester to give a 4th of July address at the still new then Corinthian Hall, a big meeting hall for theater, performances, etc., that was just blocks away from the offices of the North Star. Nearly 600 people attend the event. Douglass is a known speaker. He's a known abolitionist. He's not among strangers, but he is among a primarily white audience. There's a grand dinner that's given after the speech. Right before Douglass comes up to the podium, there is a reading of the Declaration of Independence. And then without further introduction, beyond just that reading of Declaration, Douglass walks up to the podium and begins this extraordinary oratorical performance. What to the slave is the 4th of July. The speech comes in 3 parts. The first part is a recognition of the value, courage, heroism, importance of the revolution. And he speaks in glowing and admiring terms of the founding fathers. He calls them heroes. He calls them courageous. He drops a couple of hints, such as the phrase, "With brave men, there is always remedy for oppression." He is aligning his own cause of anti-slavery with the liberatory impulse of the revolution. He says that they, the founding fathers, preferred revolution to peaceful submission to bondage. Douglass always recognized the legitimacy of violence to liberate the slave. That is, the slave had absolute moral legitimacy in resisting by force and defending with force, even lethal force, his or her freedom. And Douglass says in doing that, in adopting that position, we are emulating the brave and courageous beliefs and actions of the founding fathers. That's the first movement. Then Douglass turns into the second and the longest and most vigorous of the movements, which is a sweeping, scalding denunciation of the hypocrisy of slavery and of the human brutality of the practice of slavery in the United States. Douglass's speaking was once described as the experience of listening to Douglass speak as witnessing a tornado in a forest. And you can sense that power from that speech. And he begins by saying, "Look, I'm not going to make arguments against slavery. What would you like me to argue? That slaves are people, that they're men? Your laws recognize it by denying them, making it legal for them to learn to read, by making them legally culpable for crimes. You recognize their personhood. Am I to argue that the slave is entitled to liberty? No." And then he says the poignant phrase, "There is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him." So he kind of dismisses the idea that what you need to do here is demonstrate that slavery is wrong, and goes right into just vigorous denunciation, including the probably the most famous passage in the speech, which I will just read a little bit. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty, an unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciations of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. Those are strong words, and the way that he ends that, there is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States, makes it clear that this is not just a North versus South issue, but that the whole body of the people of the United States is implicated in this horrendous practice. Then we come to the third movement of the speech, and it's a sad reality that this speech is often anthologized and excerpted, and this last part is often taken out, which is the part in which Frederick Douglass argues for the anti-slavery character of the Constitution. Douglass insists that rather than being a pro-slavery instrument, despite the 3/5 compromise and despite the Fugitive Slave Clause, he wants to insist that the Constitution, as he says, interpreted as it ought to be interpreted, is a glorious liberty document. So Douglass becomes a fierce defender of the anti-slavery character of the Constitution, and moreover, he says there in that last section, I reject the idea that the question of the constitutionality or unconstitutionality of slavery is not a question for the people. I hold that every American citizen has a right to form an opinion of the Constitution and to propagate that opinion and to use all honorable means to make his opinion a prevailing one. Douglass's vision here is of the interpreter citizen, of American citizenship as a function of an investment in a collective debate over the meaning of the founding charter of the Constitution. To be an American citizen is to be an interpreting member of this collective textual community. It's a remarkable vision of a type of citizenship that I think this speech gives us a vision of, that it's remarkable, unique, and distinctly American. So I think I'll stop there. It's a very broad overview, but I hope it's useful as you think about the text and as you think about teaching the text.
Thank you so much, Roosevelt. I am so looking forward to having a live Q&A where we can bring some more people in to talk about these things. But we do have a minute for me to ask a question or two if you're game.
Oh, please, I'd love that.
Okay. So one of the things that really struck me both in the passage you read from the autobiography and in your final remarks about Douglass's understanding or presentation, his interpretation of citizenship, is that the argument that he shouldn't be taught as a boy is a tacit acknowledgement of his full humanity. That is, that every slave is capable of being taught to read and capable of being unfitted for slavery. So the argument itself, the tactic itself, is undermines any kind of argument or many of the arguments that you might make for natural slavery or something like that. But what's really struck me about it, and that I think connects the idea of citizenship, and I wondered if you comment on, is that if that's the case, then enslavement is not something that's done once and then sort of has its own momentum. Slaves are being enslaved every day, every moment that they're not being taught, that they're not literate, that people are participating in preventing them from being unfitted for slavery, they're being enslaved. And likewise, it seems like part of Douglass's insight was that if every moment is an opportunity for enslavement, every moment is also an opportunity to act in the interest of your liberation. And I just wondered if you would speak to that a little bit.
I think that's absolutely right. And political theorists, as probably many of you and many people watching this would know, and this is very explicit in Locke that the slave is in a state of war against the master. That is that whether applied at every continuous moment or not, the whole state of enslavement is a state of war that is only maintained by force and continuous threat or use of force. It makes me, Douglas was extraordinarily fortunate in various ways, including the fact that as he aged, he became increasingly indomitable, increasingly unmanageable. And it is after an attempted escape, that's a scheme that's busted, that's there's a snitch, and he's caught and put in jail from a plantation in Maryland. When he is caught and is in jail, waiting for his master to determine what will be done with him, and his fear and what everybody expects is that Douglas is going to be sold downriver, that is sold deeper south, where the possibilities for escape are essentially non-existent. Instead, he sends him back to Baltimore. It's one of those incredible breaks that Douglas has, and from Baltimore, he eventually makes his escape. But Douglas, at one point when he is under the brutal subjugation of a slave breaker named Covey, Douglas fights back one time and decides that he will never again be whipped without resistance. And he says, that slave is whipped most often that is whipped most easily. Mm-hmm. So Douglas recognizes that resistance to the slave system is necessary, is justified, and it's the key to assertion of the kind of, he calls it, manhood that leads to liberation. One other comment I want to make, it's only tangentially related to the question, but I think about today and the way in which today we are steering students from lower income and less privileged backgrounds to technical, professional, applied fields, with the argument that there is an economic imperative, a greater economic imperative for them to advance, that they need to take advantage of college and treat it as a job preparation tool, that there is an argument that they, more than others, ought to be giving a practical education. And that argument is so corrosive, so insidious, and it is a version of the argument that says that the kind of liberatory education that others deserve and are fit for, these students are not. So I think it's an argument that's related to this incident and the philosophy behind that incident of denying slaves the knowledge of reading.
Yeah, that's so much to talk about here. I will steal one more minute, but I think it follows nicely on that comment, because not that I spend a lot of time with Douglas, but when I do, you cannot help but just be awed by his intelligence.
Yeah.
A spectacular, you know that you're in the presence of a genius when you read him. But when you start thinking about, some of the story that you just told, and also the earlier passage from the autobiography, and the context that he bought his freedom in England and then came back to the United States, it seems like you have to also just be awed by his courage. Yeah. And I felt that as I was reading the What to a Slave speech this time, is he may have bought his freedom, but the Fugitive Slave Act is still in effect, and he's well aware that free men have been enslaved under the sort of cover of this law, and the evil incentive structures that makes it profitable for judges to not ask questions and just to enslave Black men that show up in their courts. So I wonder about this relationship between liberal education and courage, and maybe that's a little too on the nose for ACTC, but I do think about it here. I mean, his act of defiance against the slave breaker is a clear act of courage, but his act of insisting on his education is also an act of courage, and continuing to present himself, all of these autobiographies.
Yeah.
I mean, at one point I heard that he was one of the most photographed men in his moment of American
Was
history.
the most photographed person of the 19th century.
The most, not one of the most, the most. Yeah. So
Yeah.
this sort of courage, but I don't mean the next thing by suggesting it's insincere. I know it's real courage, but it's also performative.
That's right.
You know, this sort of performative courage. Do you have thoughts on this connection between? Yeah. Okay. Good.
Sure. Douglas. You know, in Pericles' funeral oration, Pericles says, you know, remember that happiness depends on liberty, and liberty depends on courage. Mm-hmm. And you know, Douglas absolutely gets that, and all these portraits that we have of Douglas, again, you know, the claim is that he's the most photographed individual. He's not smiling in one of them. He just, I mean, that was not a thing of smiling for pictures back then, but Douglas always faces the camera and kind of, he uses what was then the new medium of photography to convey strength, dignity, liberty, his own personhood, his own humanity. He uses that medium, and he sat for portraits whenever he had a chance. Like, he would seek this out and sit for portraits in order to you know, brilliantly. I mean, he became a newspaper man, right? So he understood the power of media and the power of communication. So he used his own image to convey this picture of strength and dignity and full humanity. Douglas understood that the black man needed to assert with force, when necessary, their humanity before white prejudice. His life is full of instances of this demonstration of strength, vitality through his own image. Douglas's life, you know, his life was his message. That is, you have a situation in Douglas where the medium is the message. Douglas's speech, Douglas's writing, Douglas's embodied presence was the message that he was delivering. So he lived a life that was full of public scrutiny, and where his own biography coincided exactly with the meaning of his message and of his politics.
Fascinating. We could go on, but we must not. The idea of this is to encourage a conversation, a wider conversation. And for those of you watching, I hope you feel very much invited to join that conversation. Share this with your friends. One of the benefits of Zoom is that there are always enough seats at the table for everyone. So please know that you're welcome, that everyone is welcome to join our conversation. Check the date and time on this website where you found this recording, and please join us. Or if you're watching this recording long after that Q&A happened, it should also be available in the recording. And we hope that even though we are all living at distances from each other right now, that by this means and perhaps others, we can stay in conversation, because conversation is important. Thank you so much, Roosevelt, for being our first core conversation scholar. This was just great.
Thank you, Charlie.
All right. Bye, everyone. Tune in soon for more core conversations.